The Terminator earned $500 million at the box office, but even more from early bets on everything from California real estate to now a $718 billion investment firm. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, a reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, Jemima McAvoy. Jemima, thanks for coming on in.
Thanks for having me.
Forbes has some interesting news to report. You're reporting that Arnold Schwarzenegger is a billionaire. We all know who the actor Arnold Schwarzenegger is, but he comes from very humble beginnings. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if a lot of people know Arnold Schwarzenegger's background, but he's from Austria, obviously. He's from a small town called Thal, which has a population today of about 2,500 people, but back when he was born there, he's 76 years old, so 76 years ago, it was a lot smaller, just a few hundred people. He, explains his background was very, they didn't have a lot growing up, but he obviously made a name for himself first in bodybuilding and then in acting. And then probably a lesser known part of his legacy is as an investor. He's been a very aggressive investor over the years and has turned his celebrity into a fortune.
And the investor side of him is what helped him propel over the line of billionaire. And we will get to that in a moment. But first, what most people know Arnold Schwarzenegger as is the actor. So take us to the beginning of his acting career and then walk us through a turning point for him, which was the comedy Twins, and how he leveraged that to make a decent chunk of change.
Sure. So Arnold moved to the U.S. in, I think, 1968, and he got his first acting role in 1970 in Hercules in New York. It was a pretty small film, didn't end up doing very well, but it was his, bridge into acting. And the interesting thing about Arnold is that he was a millionaire before he ever even took a big role in a film. So this meant that this was from investing his money from bodybuilding and some side hustles into real estate in California. So he managed to make $1 million, and this gave him a financial freedom that meant that he didn't have to take the first acting role that came across his plate. So instead of taking, like side characters, he held out for, the big role, which was a pretty interesting thing to do considering the fact that when he moved to the U.S., here's a guy with a thick Austrian accent. A lot of people didn't want to take him for their movies. They didn't want to be his agent, so he really had to fight for this, but he did end up getting his breakout role in Terminator in the 70s, and he was paid about $750,000 for that role, which, was a huge blockbuster. But as you mentioned, Twins was really a big moment for him. In the 1990s, he stars in this buddy comedy with Danny DeVito, and he had only done action movies up until this point, and he'd been making a lot of money doing them. He'd been getting 20, even 25, 30 million for movies in the 90s. But he decides he doesn't just want to be, cast as this action hero who can't do anything else. So he pitches the studios with Danny DeVito of a comedy, and they're hesitant to make it because they just want to make another action movie. So what he does is he says, okay, I won't take a salary. Instead, I'll take a portion of, the sales of how the movie does. So they come to this agreement where he's going to get just under 20% of all of the back end. So that means like any DVD sales, any kind of money that the film makes. And this ends up being, his biggest financial success as a film. He makes over $35 million from it. So it kind of just shows how he was very early to early to negotiate these smart profit-sharing deals, ended up making him a fortune in Hollywood.
How he made his money from Twins was a gamble, but that seems to be a theme in Arnold Schwarzenegger's life, especially when it comes to investing. You mentioned he's an aggressive investor. He's not risk averse. He's been in nearly 50 movies, but what else contributed to that fortune?
Yeah, definitely. So, the big foundation of his fortune comes from films. So, as you said, he made 50 movies. They grossed $5.5 billion at the box office, and he took home, after taxes and fees and everything, about $200 million. And instead of sitting on that, spending it like a lot of, Hollywood people do, he made some pretty big and out there investments, and some of them paid off and some of them didn't. He invested a lot in commercial real estate in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica specifically. So he started up by buying apartment buildings, and then he would sell it, a few years later for double the price, and ended up owning a significant amount of real estate. And then he branched into office buildings and commercial properties too. And these are, multi-million-dollar properties that he was buying and flipping. And so he became a pretty significant landlord. Outside of that, he was also pretty active and forward-thinking in investing in the stock market. So he was a relatively early investor in Starbucks. He participated in the Series A round of Google. But then his biggest investment, at least that I was able to find, is he bought just under 5% of Dimensional Fund Advisors, which was at the time when he invested in the 1990s, was like a pretty small investment firm. It's ballooned to, it's about 60 times the size of what it was when he invested. It's now $700 billion in assets under management. And so his investment has grown by, roughly 60 times, and that's worth nearly $500 million today. So, he took some early gambles on small companies or companies that were up and coming, and these turned out to be really successful.
I want to get back to his real estate portfolio. You mentioned he has places in Santa Monica, in California. I want to go across the country to Ohio a bit and talk about the Easton Mall and why that connection is so relevant today.
Yeah, so a little known thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger is he does own a stake in Easton Mall, which is a mall just outside of Columbus that was started by Les Wexner, the former owner of Victoria's Secret and L Brands, which was a big retail conglomerate. So Les Wexner had a bit of a fall from grace, or a significant fall from grace, when he was caught up in the scandal around Jeffrey Epstein. He was Jeffrey Epstein's big financial backer. And he started this mall, and Arnold was an early investor and has continued to invest. So it's not clear if Les Wexner still owns a stake in the mall, but it was his project, and so at some point Arnold did credit Les as a mentor / teacher of his. So we know that they had a close connection at some point, but it's unclear if that still exists today.
You mentioned some gambles that did pay off for Arnold Schwarzenegger, but not everything has always been rosy for him financially. Can you walk us through those times, especially the failure of Planet Hollywood as well as his divorce from Maria Shriver?
Yeah, so I'm sure some people will remember Planet Hollywood. It was a restaurant chain, like Hollywood themed, that was started by the same guy behind the Hard Rock Cafe. And so they got a bunch of actors, including Arnold and Sylvester Stallone and Bruce Willis, to invest in this chain. It went public in the early 90s, I think 1991, at a $3 billion valuation. So it was a pretty hot IPO back at the time. And then just a few years later, it went bankrupt. It was kind of a bit of a financial disaster. A lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of investors did and actors did, but Arnold was actually smart and took 2 years to negotiate his ownership stake, which meant that he actually came out without losing any money and did make money, according to his financial advisor. So another big splashy investment that he made was he bought a $130 million Boeing commercial jet, which he then leased back to Singapore Airlines. And so this was a big investment at the time. Everybody was talking about, this crazy $130 million purchase. And it didn't end up doing as well as they had anticipated, but he didn't lose money on it. So those are a couple of things. But, as you mentioned, the divorce from Maria Shriver, who is a Kennedy heir and a former newscaster, that is probably his most costly mistake, if you will. We don't know the arrangements that he had with her, whether they had a prenup or not. It's not public, so we did our math assuming that they didn't have a prenup, so we took away 50% of his assets when they divorced in 2021, and so he could be worth double the amount that we put him at, which is $1 billion today, if he hadn't been through the divorce. So that is probably on the list of, investments that didn't go right. That's the top of it.
Arnold Schwarzenegger was also mentioned recently in Donald Trump's New York City hush money trial. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, was a key witness in Trump's trial, and he was testifying about, paying for and killing stories from women about Trump. And it also came up that he was doing the same thing for Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was running for governor in 2003. So David Pecker testified that he made an agreement with Arnold where he would basically buy stories from women that were coming forward to him with allegations of affairs or sexual harassment even. And then he would buy the stories from the women and then, quote, kill them, which means, pay for the story and then you make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And he testified at trial that he did that with either somewhere between 30 and 40 women. So we knew that in the past he had faced allegations of sexual misconduct. The LA Times had this big blockbuster report from when Arnold was running for governor where they outlined over a dozen allegations from women of groping and harassment. And Arnold at the time denied them, but he's since admitted wrongdoing and apologized for those allegations. But this was new at the trial because just of the scale that David Pecker outlined of 30 to 40 women is a lot higher than what was previously reported. So that did bring him back in the headlines. And his representatives didn't respond to requests for comment there from me.
I do want to talk about that foray into politics 20 years ago. How did that affect his fortune, if it did in any way?
Yeah, so Arnold famously did not take any salary when he was governor of California. And, one of the reasons for that was he was so wealthy already, but he did forego, he's estimated around $200 million worth of movie paychecks when he was governor. He was churning out 2 films a year and taking home $20 million plus for each film. So over his 2 terms in office, that equates to about $200 million. And he also wasn't able to play an active role in managing his investments. So all of his investments had to go into a blind trust that was managed by his investment advisor. So for about 8 years, he wasn't, actively bringing in new income, but he was still generating income off of his previous investments and some small roles that he played. So,
and can you talk about a moment that you mentioned in your story when he was sitting, I believe, at a basketball game and was talking to his financial advisor? What did he indicate that he do?
Yeah, so I did speak with his financial advisor for the story, and he was kind of outlining to me what type of investor Arnold is and how he is so he likes taking a risk. And this was during the financial crisis, and so they weren't allowed to talk about his investments as part of his governorship and the blind trust. But he says that they were at a Lakers game in I think 2009, and Arnold turned to him and was like, "You better not be selling right now." And he said that that's, all his other clients were panicking during the financial crisis and telling him to offload assets. But Arnold knew that this was just a dip and things would come back up. And so he thought that was a pretty good example of, this guy being very smart when it comes to investing and not afraid of risk at all.
Aside from his financial advisor, who else did you speak to, and what did you learn about who Arnold Schwarzenegger is?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Arnold would not speak with me for the story. I think generally he kind of shies away from talking about wealth/financial matters. But I did speak to his longtime financial advisor, Paul Wachter, who is the founder of Main Street Advisors, which is a celebrity advisory firm that was founded basically because he was advising Arnold and realized that there was a market for more celebrity clients. But so Paul knows him very well, gave me a lot of, background on his investments, and then also spoke to his chief of staff, who is also a longtime employee of Arnold, who's worked with him since his days as governor, and then his former press secretary from when he was governor. So I really wanted to speak with people that, have worked with him a long time and know him and could kind of get into his brain a little bit and tell me how he managed to become so successful in investing. And then finally, I spoke with the head of the Schwarzenegger Institute, which Many people might not know this, but after he left his position as governor in 2011, I think, he arranged for a $20 million donation to USC to start the Schwarzenegger Institute, which is a public policy think tank. He's still involved today, so I spoke to the head of that about his involvement there.
Something interesting anecdote you included in the story is that I believe that during his time as governor, no one was allowed to use the word tired around him. It was referred to as the T word. I'm wondering if now in his mid-70s, if he's still on the go, not slowing down, not using the word tired. What does a typical day in Arnold Schwarzenegger's life look like?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if the word tired is still banned, but he does seem to be as active as ever. You know, according to his chief of staff, he's up at around 5 every morning to feed his animals. He lives and has a donkey and a pig and a bunch of other farm animals at his house. So then he is working all day. You know, he's like shooting movies, he's running his institute, his charity. So even though he was fitted with a pacemaker earlier this year, he is as busy as ever, according to his chief of staff. So I think that's also another key reason that he's managed to be so successful. You know, there's only 14 other celebrities that we have on our billionaires list of, 2,500 plus billionaires around the world. Only 14 celebrities in the US have managed to do this. So it's not easy. And a big part of that seems to be his work ethic.
His acting career alone didn't get him on the Forbes billionaires list. His investments played a huge part in that, as you said. So is there any indication that his investments will keep him there?
It seems at this point that he should stay on the list unless there's a big, economic downturn and his investments don't perform well, then he could potentially dip off. But if anything, his fortune has been growing a lot, as far as we can tell. So I wouldn't expect him to drop off anytime soon, unless there's some other big, thing that we can't predict coming up. But I think he'll be on there for the foreseeable future.
Jemima McAvoy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.